So again, welcome to today's session on the old new information technique. So we're just going to jump in. We're going to look at two examples. And my question to you is, which of these do you find more readable? So the first one reads as follows. For millennia, wildland fires have arguably been the most important disturbance process throughout many Western forests. Seed germination and establishment, growth patterns, plant community composition and structure, rates of mortality, soil productivity, and other properties and processes of Western forest ecosystems are often strongly shaped by fire disturbance regimes. The second example reads as follows. For millennia, wildland fires have been arguably the most important disturbances in many Western forests. Fire strongly influences many aspects of Western forest ecosystems, including germination and establishment of seedlings, patterns of growth, composition and structure of plant communities, rates of mortality, and productivity of soils. So of these, do you find one more readable than the other? Just take a minute or two and contribute in the chat before we continue. So we're starting to see some preference emerge for that second example. And if you chose the second example, what you might be doing is already showing appreciation for the old new information technique, which we're going to deconstruct a little bit later on. So don't worry, we're going to look at these examples again momentarily. So when we're talking about the old new information technique, basically it's a very simple method for organizing information within sentences. And the premise is actually quite simple, which is great because sometimes the simpler strategy is, the easier it is to incorporate into our own writing practice. But basically what we do is we recognize, hey, what is the key information from that previous sentence that I'm going to continue to build on in my next sentence. And we incorporate reference to that previous information, that old information, and we insert it deliberately at the beginning of the next sentence. And then we put the new information after the main verb in that next sentence. It's a very common structure in the English language, and this is one of the reasons why we might gravitate toward it. As in English text because of its common presence in English communication. So the concept that sort of grounds the old new information technique is this notion that we're taking common elements and we're knitting them more closely together. We're linking them more closely together, similar to the links in a chain. So there's a bit of overlapping information between sentences, which makes the connection between those sentences a lot more obvious, which means that our reader doesn't have to do as much work to understand how one sentence relates to the other. So if we revisit that example that we were looking at earlier, we see in the first example that the old information it relates to this notion of fire. So the subject of the first sentence in both examples are these wildland fires in Western forests. But in the first example, when we look at the second sentence in that first example, that element of sameness, this reference to fire, happens is included at the very end of that second sentence. So the reader has to hold a lot more information in their working memory to understand how the second sentence relates to the earlier, to the preceding sentence. So it's just that distance in terms of the shared subject is much farther apart, which just makes it a little bit more difficult for a reader to understand the relationship between the two sentences. In contrast, when we look at the second example here, that connection between the subject of wildland fires is much more obvious in the second sentence because it appears right at the beginning of that second sentence. We have reference to fire immediately, and so we understand how this second sentence is really effectively building on that preceding sentence. And that's really the premise of the old new information technique, really looking to see how we can take that sort of shared information and put it at the beginning of a sentence in order to tighten the relationship between the two sentences. We'll look at another example. So here is another example, slightly shorter so that we can really hone in on how that old new information technique is being applied. So it reads as follows: populations of coexisting, closely related but diverging variants of HCV RNA molecules are termed quasi-species. Quasi-species occur in many RNA viruses. So here we're just taking that very explicit reference to quasi-species, and we are just inserting it at the beginning of that second sentence so we understand, okay, this is a continuation of that earlier thought, but into a new sentence. And then we're including some new information, this reference to, well, this actually occurs in many RNA viruses, and that new information is appearing after that main verb of occur. And so this, again, is the basic premise of the old new information technique in action. Now, we have some flexibility in terms of how we can make use of this writing technique. One of the most common ways in which you can take this principle and apply it in your writing is to make use of the word this or these plus a noun to easily reference what has been stated in the previous sentence. So here we have an example. Sykes and Wilson found that short bursts of intense exercise showed more benefits than longer but less intense workouts. This finding is consistent with those of other researchers. So I'd like you to reflect on this question. What might be a benefit of this approach? And please contribute in the chat. We'll take a minute or two as we consider what might be the benefit of making use of this or these plus a noun in applying the old new information technique. So there's a comment in the chat. Well, is the benefit is that it's less repetitive? That is exactly correct. Because when we are making use of any individual writing strategy, we want to think about how overusing that strategy might lead to some other problems in our writing. So if we were always using the exact same phrasing, it would become quite repetitive and it would potentially become more wordy as well, especially if you were referencing a long subject. So making use of this or these plus a noun, it's going to still make the connection to that previous sentence very obvious, but it's going to add a little bit of variation in how it's being expressed, and that will help promote readability at the same time. So that old new information technique, it can be combined with some techniques that go beyond the simple repetition of the old information. But when we are making use of this approach, we want to make sure that we're not confusing our readers with our pronoun use. So here we have two examples of sort of this approach being used, but there's a problem that emerges. What is the problem that emerges in these two examples? So the first one reads as follows. When chicken embryos die during incubation, hatchery producers suffer economic losses. This occurs for two reasons. The second example, when chicken embryos die during incubation, hatchery producers suffer economic losses. It occurs for two main reasons. What's the problem here? Why is this of concern to us as writers and readers? Let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. So we have a comment in the chat indicating, well, the problem is to do with ambiguity, and that's absolutely correct. We don't know in both instances, are we referring to those economic losses? Are we referring to those, the death of the chicken embryos? So we always have to be cautious when we're making use of our pronouns. And if we're attaching nouns consistently, it's going to reduce the likelihood of any confusion around what those referential links are referring to in the preceding sentence. So we could resolve this, we could solve this problem very easily. So in the first good example, when chicken embryos die during incubation, hatchery producers suffer economic losses. These losses occur for two reasons. So it becomes very clear that we're referencing those economic losses. In contrast, in the second example, hatchery producers suffer economic losses. When chicken embryos die during incubation, these deaths occur for two reasons. Again, it makes it much more clear what's being referenced in the preceding sentence, those chicken embryo deaths. So I will acknowledge that I have seen the solitary this or the solitary it in published papers, but I would recommend that you don't emulate this simply because you don't want to run into any potential pronoun confusion. The worst thing that can happen if you are consistently using a noun after these or this, for instance, is that an editor might say, oh, you don't actually need this noun, and then they would remove it for you. But generally, if you want to ensure that there's no misunderstanding when someone's reading, attach a noun to your pronoun to make it really evident what you're referencing. Okay, so one of the fun things about the old new information technique is that it can actually be used across multiple sentences. So let's take a look at this example, and I'd like you to note how many sentences are actually making use of this technique in this paragraph. So this excerpt reads as follows. Despite the popularity of the domestic cat, surprisingly little is known about cat social behavior or factors influencing the human-cat relationship. The lack of research in this field may be due in part to a common misconception that cats are not a social species. Although many think of cats as solitary, domestic cats are facultatively social and can live either socially or solitarily, depending on their environment and upbringing. Domestic cats display a wide array of social behaviors with conspecifics and interact non-randomly with preferred associates and with humans. So how many times are you seeing that old new information technique in action in this paragraph? Let's take a minute or so and contribute in the chat. So basically, this technique is being used throughout the entire paragraph. And we have that broken down in the chat. I'm going to break it down on the slide. But I really like this example because it shows just how effectively this technique can be used without it turning the writing into something clunky and repetitive. If anything, this technique is actually establishing a nice flow in the writing. So we have, as already noted in the chat, that second sentence, the lack of research, is referencing back to the preceding sentence. Then later, although many think of cats as solitary, that's referencing back to the preceding sentence. And then lastly, domestic cats display a wide array of social behaviors. That's referencing back to that to its previous sentence as well. So if we look at what the writer is doing, we see that, okay, we have reference to how, something appears in each sentence. I'm going to break it down just a little bit further for us. So that little is known translates into lack of research in the next sentence. So we're seeing how we can make use of synonyms and paraphrase when we are making use of the old new information technique. So we avoid that potential repetition while still maintaining flow and cohesion in our text. In the next example, we have reference to a common misconception that translates into many think in the next sentence. And then lastly, our last example of the old new technique in action, we have reference to how cats can live either socially or solitarily, and that translates into this phrasing, wide array of social behaviors. So this is the third way in which we can really start to incorporate this technique in our writing. So the first way that we have to use the old new information technique is to simply repeat the subject that is uniting the two sentences and just use that exact same phrasing or very similar phrasing and insert it at the beginning of the next sentence. The other one that we saw is making use of this or these plus a noun as a referential link to harken back to what was said in the preceding sentence. And here we see how we can make more use of synonyms and paraphrase to help establish those strong linkages across the two sentences. So it's a really great technique that has all these different ways in which we can implement it to help establish flow in our writing. So one of the reasons why we look at it from all these different perspectives is to recognize that we can use repetition, but we don't want to fall into needless repetition when writing. Because repetition does have a role. It can help to create emphasis, encourage reader retention, and make the connections really obvious. But if we have too much repetition, it can be quite dull and boring for our readers. So by paraphrasing or using synonyms, we can still maintain the core or the essence of the old new information technique, still making those connections more clear, but translating into a more enjoyable reading experience. We can also make use of the old new technique, old new information technique in combination with signposting. So if you attended yesterday's session on signposting, you'll know all about signposting, but if this is a new concept, basically signposts are words or phrases that signal relationships or larger moves within a text. So some of the key relationships that we might encounter in writing: cause and effect, commonalities, contrast, and some of the words that signal or signpost those relationships include words like accordingly, as a result, or in the same way, echoing, or for contrast, although, but, however, etc., etc. If you're signaling a larger move, so you're transitioning from one section or one chapter to the other, you can make use of signposting with phrasing like, this section has demonstrated that, it is now necessary to explain how, and so on and so forth. So if you are interested in learning more about signposting, you can watch the video on the Sure YouTube site all about signposting, or I would also recommend that you explore the Academic Phrase Bank at the University of Manchester, a very useful resource for all writers who are looking to enhance their writing skill set. So if we look at that old new information technique in combination with signposting, it can look something like this. So for instance, as a result of this ruling, because of these recent developments, despite this upward trend, although this development has, similar to studies, etc., etc., etc. So what we see is in the bolded black font that as a result, because of, despite, although, similar, those are those signposts that are communicating something about the relationship that is emerging between sentences. And then we have that referential link, that old information captured through the this or these plus a noun. This ruling, these recent developments, this upward trend, this development, studies. So you can make use of this as part of your use of old new. You can combine it with the signposting to just give yourself yet another tool that you can use. I will just note some clarification and caution here. I sometimes get questions about starting a sentence with the word because. Grammatically, it it is grammatical to begin a sentence with because if the entirety of the sentence is a complete sentence, the reason why we are often instructed to stay away from using because to begin a sentence is because it can lend itself to sentence fragments. That noted, it has a slightly more informal tone compared to some other phrases, some other signaling language that you could use, some other signposts rather. So if you're worried about tone, I would avoid staying away from beginning a sentence with because, but it is grammatically fine. And when it comes to signposts, just generally, you don't want to over rely on signposts. This is something that I discuss in my other session because it can be very easy to overuse signposts. And if many sentences are beginning with signposting language, it can communicate that there's a lack of other writing strategies that are being used in the text. But let's wrap up today's session with a quick application of the old new information technique. So here we have just a little excerpt, and I would encourage you to reword the following using the old new information technique and to contribute in the chat. So that the little excerpt reads as follows. Lately, most movies I've seen have been merely second-rate entertainment, but occasionally there are some with worthwhile themes. The rapid disappearance of the Indian culture is the topic of a recent movie I saw. So how might you rephrase or reword this so that the sentences follow the old new information technique? Let's take 2 or 3 minutes and contribute in the chat. All right, so here's just one response. As with so much of any sort of revision exercise that we're working with, there are likely multiple options available to us. But here we have a possible revision as rewritten. Lately, most movies I've seen have been merely second-rate entertainment, but occasionally there are some with worthwhile themes. One recent movie I saw was about the rapid disappearance of the Indian culture. But I do like the change that has been suggested in the chat as well. So referencing a theme as opposed to the reference to the movie at the beginning, I think that would work just as effectively. But in both instances, what we're still doing is we're taking that referential link, that subject that's connecting us to that previous sentence more concretely, and we're inserting it at the beginning of the second sentence. So our takeaways from today's Style Spotlight: the old new information technique is a simple but very powerful way to promote flow and cohesion in writing. And if we want to be aware of avoiding needless repetition, we can also make use of this or these plus a noun or occasional signposts or synonyms or paraphrase in implementing this strategy in our own writing. So thank you so much for joining me for today's Style Spotlight. A quick reminder of some of the University Library's services and supports. So if you're looking for insight into math help, grad skills, study skills, research support, writing help, all of that and more, do check out what's happening at the library.